welcome to the Bible Source Text Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing Genesis chapter 3. This is where we get into the start of all the problems. So this is the chapter where we see the fall of mankind and the expulsion from Eden. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now the serpent was more cunning than any animal of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said to the woman, "Has God really said, 'You shall not eat from any tree of the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, 'You shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die.' The serpent said to the woman, 'You certainly will not die. For God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will become like God, knowing good and evil.'" So here you've got a serpent tempting Adam and Eve. The Jewish interpretation of the serpent is typically that the serpent represents a desire to sin. That this is a symbolic representation of that. Serpents are relatively common in ancient mythology. The Mesopotamians, in the Epic of Gilgamesh loses his chance at immortality to a snake. He finds a plant like a box thorn, full of thorns, but if he manages to keep a hold of it, he can become a young man again. With the plant of the old man becomes a young man, and yet he has a snake come up to him and carry off the plant. This idea of immortality being lost as a result of a snake is seen in Mesopotamia. The Sumerian god of the underworld, Nin-Gish-Siddha, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is often depicted as a snake and has an association with trees. So there are some common motifs through here. We Christians typically identify this serpent as Satan. That comes from Revelations chapter 12, verse 9. "And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." And so this identification of the serpent as the devil comes from this New Testament verse. What we see here is the serpent starts by questioning God's command. He says, did God really say not to eat from any tree from the garden? He frames it as a legitimate question, sort of there's an implication there that Eve may have misunderstood what God wanted to do. What is interesting about the narrative here, what is interesting about the text, is that Eve says, "Oh no, we can eat from anything except that one tree." So Eve emphasizes their liberty. She says, "We can eat from any tree except this one restriction." Satan sort of zeroes in on the restriction. He says, well, there's this one tree you can't eat from. And then, of course, the serpent responds to all of this by just telling Eve that either she didn't remember what God said correctly, or even saying that God lied, implying that God lied. In verse 6, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took some of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves waist coverings." So Eve looks at the fruit, sees it as desirable. She saw sin as desirable. Their knowledge of evil, they obtained the knowledge of good and evil, but that came from disobedience. You've got this idea that by choosing to disobey, they experienced evil, and now they know what evil is. And as we talked about in chapter 2, they have died a spiritual death at that point and created the certainty that death would inevitably come later. Some theologians have argued for the idea of original sin from this. Medieval Catholic theologians argued about original sin. The Calvinists might call it depravity. At any rate, what we do all agree upon is that this is where capacity for sin entered into humanity. You have this narrative around a loss of innocence, and you've got this idea that all human beings have an inclination towards sin now, and that the world is no longer this perfect Garden of Eden anymore. You've got the world itself, creation itself, being corrupted and affected by mankind's sin. And that's why their nudity becomes shameful. As we mentioned in the last chapter, their nudity was not shameful because of their innocence. Now it is. And so they try to cover it, but with an inadequate covering. They're promised enlightenment, but instead they receive shame and guilt. If we think about creation as the temple, you've got this idea of sort of their disobedience desecrating the temple. And I think that is an idea that would have probably been assumed by ancient Near Eastern readers that maybe goes over our heads as modern day readers, because these ideas of approaching sacred spaces and ritual impurities and things maybe don't translate as well in the modern world. but I think that is sort of behind the text potentially. Verse 8, Now they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Then the Lord God called to the man and said to him, Where are you? He said, Heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. He said, Who told you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree from which I have commanded you not to eat? The man said, The woman you gave to be with me, she gave me some of the fruit of the tree, and I ate. Adam immediately throws his wife under the bus. Then the Lord God said to the woman, What is this that you have done? The woman said, The serpent deceived me, and I ate. Again, trying to pass the buck. But we've got here this image of God communing with man directly. And you have God walking through the garden and directly communing with Adam and Eve. God asks Adam questions. It's important to emphasize this is not out of ignorance. This is God asking pointed questions directly at Adam. This is your parents asking you what you've done when they already know what you've done, but they're asking to make the point that they already know. And so, Adam tries to pass the blame off on Eve. Not only that, he says, it's the woman you put here that gave me the fruit. So in an indirect way, he's blaming God himself. Eve also tries to pass the blame off to the serpent, but neither of those excuses excuse the fact that they still chose to eat the fruit. The serpent may have tried to convince Eve, but Eve still chose to eat the fruit. Eve may have given Adam the fruit, but Adam still chose to take a bite. So this does not get them off the hook in any way to try to pass that off on someone else. The Lord God said to the serpent, Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all the livestock, and more than any animal of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will make enemies of you and the woman, and your offspring and her descendant. And he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. This in Christian theology is interpreted as the first prophecy of the Christ, first prophecy of Jesus. In Christian Bibles, the word descendant is sometimes capitalized, as that descendant is thought to be Jesus. The serpent bruising him on the heel refers to the crucifixion, and the descendant crushing or bruising the snake's head, bruising in this translation. Some translations have crushing his head. That refers to the ultimate defeat of Satan at the end of the world. And so you've got Christian theology developing on this that interprets this in that way. Continuing on, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall deliver children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. You've got this phrase, desire for your husband. I mean, that's referring to sort of marital conflict, discord within the marriage, but you've also got this image of almost a hierarchy, which we see throughout the ancient world, right? The idea that the man's the head of the household and was ruling over his wife. But what's interesting about this is we see that being a consequence of the world being fallen, not an ideal. We don't see that hierarchy between men and women, of men being over women, as being something inherent in mankind when the Garden of Eden when they're in the Garden of Eden. We see that coming as a result of sin entering the world. And so I think, there are theologians who argue that women being subservient to men is a natural and inherent thing that God ordained. And maybe you could argue that that's what this verse says, but you're also seeing this verse in the context of, this not being ideal. This is very much not the ideal situation. And so then that does raise the question of what is the place of that sort of thing in Christianity? If Jesus' sacrifice on the cross opens up a sort of a new way of doing things, a new covenant, where does that place these old ideas? I think that is a strike against perspectives like complementarianism even, and certainly more old-fashioned ideas about gender roles are definitely weakened by this argument. I would also point out the fact that the early church had women in position of authority. And so that would seem to suggest this is potentially outdated or it was outdated 2,000 years ago even. Moving on to verse 17, Then to Adam he said, Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, You shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. With hard labor you shall eat from it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles shall grow for you, Yet you shall eat the plants of the field, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. This is, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, right? We've got this idea of a fallen creation, death, decay, hard labor, work simply to survive. They're no longer the caretakers of this sacred duty. They now have to either work or starve to death. All the problems of the world, and this will lead to things, this will be disease, death. Eventually this will lead to things like war and inequality, and really just man's mortality itself, all coming from the introduction of sin into the world. It's also worth pointing out, God says, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and eaten from the tree, you will be punished for this. Eve's temptation did not get Adam off the hook. The fact that Eve said, hey, do this, does not get Adam off the hook on that. Adam had the moral capacity to make that decision for himself, and he chose poorly. Now the man named his wife Eve, because she was the mother of all the living. I mentioned that in the last episode, how Eve means source of life. And the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. So this is the first death we see in the text, and it is God killing animals to cover Adam and Eve. A lot of Christians interpret this as a prophecy of Christ, that while Adam and Eve's attempt to cover their sin was inadequate, God will create a way that is adequate to cover their sin. Verse 22, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us. Again, there's that plural, like Elohim, being used here to refer to God, possible reference to the Trinity. Knowing good and evil now, and now he might reach out with his hand and take fruit also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken. So he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword which turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. You could understand this, not allowing him to live forever with the tree of life as really an act of mercy, because who would want to live forever in a fallen and sinful state? What you're doing there is prolonging suffering, really. As humans age, right? We age, we get old, we start to break down. And so the idea of allowing someone to live forever in that state being crueler than allowing them to die, that's something that might be a harsh truth that we can nonetheless wrap our brains around. Now, let's talk about the cherubim. This is the first mention of the cherubim. We use the term cherub to refer to like Renaissance era art of little baby angels. That is not the biblical description of the cherubim. They are not described here, but they are described in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. Here's how Ezekiel describes the cherubim. This was their appearance. They had human form. Each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like a calf's hoof, and they sparkled like polished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, were human hands. And for the faces and wings of the 4 of them, their wings touched one another. Their faces did not turn when they moved. Each went straight forward. As for the form of their faces, each had a human face. All 4 had the face of a lion on the right, and the face of a bull on the left. All 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each had 2 touching another being and 2 covering their bodies. The cherubim were said to attend directly to God's throne. They were a common motif in ancient Israel. They were on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. The term cherubim is derived from the Akkadian word karabu, which refers to one who gives a blessing. Some have drawn a connection between the cherubim and the Lamassu in Mesopotamian mythology. Lamassu being sort of guardian spirits that were said to guard sacred places. Kings would often put Lamassu statues in their palaces. You'd often see them on the outsides of temples to sort of guard the temples. They're described in similar-ish terms, but really if you see images of Lamassu, they don't look exactly like this either. But there, could there be a connection there? Possibly. You've got the idea of the cherubim guarding the entrance to the Garden of Eden in a similar way. All right, so that is Genesis chapter 3 with the fall of man. We will pick up next time with Genesis chapter 4. We'll get into Cain and Abel, so that should be exciting. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time. Thanks.